I never thought I'd come back to Willow Creek. Not after everything that happened here. The town was small, quiet, and stuck in a time warp. But when you lose your job, your apartment lease expires, and your savings account starts whispering threats at you, well, suddenly the idea of going home doesn't sound so bad. That home, by the way, was my family's old farmhouse. A creaky, century-old place that had seen more storms than most sailors. My grandfather built it after the war, brick by brick, with his own hands. Folks used to say he poured his soul into that land. When he passed, my parents couldn't bear to stay, so they sold it off cheap and moved to the city. Decades later, the place went into foreclosure. I guess fate, irony, or maybe divine mischief decided I was the one to bring it back. When I first drove up the old gravel road, I didn't even recognize it. The paint had peeled into ghostly curls, the windows were cracked, and the porch leaned like an old man in the wind. The barn was half collapsed, and the fields were overgrown with knee-high weeds. But beneath all that ruin, I could still see my childhood. The swing Grandpa built still hung from the oak tree, its rope frayed but stubbornly holding on. I parked the truck and stepped out. The air smelled like dust and nostalgia. I remember standing there, hands on my hips, thinking, well, old man, let's bring you back. It took me weeks just to get the basics done. New roof panels, fresh siding, patching holes in the floor where raccoons had apparently started a family reunion. Every night, I'd sit on the porch with a cold beer and listen to the crickets. For the first time in years, life felt simple, honest, real. Neighbors started noticing, too. A few would slow their trucks as they passed, wave, and call out things like, "Good to see someone's bringing her back," or "That place has history, son, don't let it go." I liked that. It felt good to belong somewhere again. Then came the letter. It was a bright Saturday morning. I'd just finished replacing the porch railing and was feeling pretty proud of myself when I noticed something taped to the gate. A plain white envelope, neatly sealed. I figured it was from a neighbor, maybe a welcome note or someone offering to sell fresh eggs. Nope. The letter inside was printed on thick, official-looking paper. At the top was a logo I'd never seen before, Willow Creek Homeowners Association. The letter began politely enough, thanking me for revitalizing one of our community's historic properties. Then it dropped the bomb. According to their records, I owed $4,212.38 in unpaid homeowner dues, with interest accrued since 1971. I read it twice, then a third time, thinking maybe I was misreading it. But nope, it said dues from 1971. I wasn't even an idea in my parents' minds back then. At the bottom was a signature in careful, looping handwriting. Margaret L. Phelps, HOA Treasurer. The name stopped me cold. I hadn't heard that name since I was a kid, but every story about her came flooding back. Margaret Phelps, the self-appointed queen of Willow Creek. She ran the local bake sale, the school board, and apparently now, the HOA. Grandpa used to call her the sheriff of sidewalks. She once fined a man for having an unapproved mailbox color. I laughed at first. Surely this was a mix-up, some paperwork mistake or prank. But as the day went on, the laughter faded. I started to think about the timing. The farmhouse had been empty for decades. Why now? Why me? That night, I looked up the HOA's contact number listed on the letter. Sure enough, there was a website outdated and clunky with 3 pages. About, newsletters, and pay dues. The treasurer's contact information matched the letter exactly. Against my better judgment, I dialed the number. After a few rings, a voice answered. Sharp, clear, and dripping with smug satisfaction. Well, she said. I was wondering when I'd hear from a Daniels again. Margaret, I asked. The one and only, she replied. Welcome back to Willow Creek. I see you've been doing some work on your family's property. Lovely progress, now about those back dues. I nearly choked. You can't be serious. That debt is from 1971. My grandfather was alive then. That's right, she said sweetly. And since you've taken ownership, the dues and the property's obligations transfer to you. That's how our association works. I tried reasoning with her. I told her I didn't even know this HOA existed, that no one had contacted my family in 50 years, but she just chuckled. Rules are rules, Mr. Daniels. We take community responsibilities very seriously here. You wouldn't want to start your return off on the wrong foot, would you?" Her tone made my skin crawl. When I hung up, I stood there for a while, staring at the walls of the old farmhouse. I could almost hear my grandfather's voice, the one that used to rumble when he got angry. He'd warned me about her, about how she tried to rope him into her neighborhood association nonsense back in the 70s. He'd refused, said no one was going to tell him what color to paint his barn or when to mow his fields. And now, 50 years later, Margaret Phelps was still trying to finish the fight she started with him. I looked down at the letter again, that neat signature glaring up at me like a challenge. Well, I thought, if Margaret Phelps wants a fight, she's about to get one. Because this farmhouse isn't just property. It's family. And no HOA queen is taking it from me. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of a woodpecker hammering away at my porch post. I watched it for a while and thought, "Buddy, you're working hard for free. You'd make a great HOA member." I should have let it go. I should have just ignored the letter, laughed it off, and gone back to fixing the barn. But that's the thing about me. Once something doesn't make sense, it starts gnawing at me like a loose floorboard under your heel. So after 2 cups of coffee and a pep talk from my reflection, I decided to call Margaret back. The phone rang twice before she picked up. Willow Creek Homeowners Association, Treasurer Phelps speaking. Her tone was syrupy but sharp, like a candy apple with a razor blade inside. "Margaret, it's me again, Daniels," I said. "Look, about that letter." "Oh, yes," she interrupted, as if she'd been expecting me. "We were just discussing your case at our last board meeting. You've been quite the topic of conversation." I blinked. "My case?" "Well, you see, property obligations don't disappear just because owners do," she said. "Your grandfather's unpaid dues have been accumulating interest for decades. The total balance is—" "I know the balance," I snapped. "And it's ridiculous. You can't charge me for something that happened before I was born." Margaret's voice dropped lower. "Mr. Daniels, the HOA charter is quite clear. Membership runs with the land, not the person. You inherited the property, you inherit the obligations." I laughed, but it wasn't from amusement. "Margaret, that's insane. My grandfather built this house before you even filed that HOA paperwork." Silence, then that little hum she did when she thought she'd cornered someone. "He may have built it, but he signed the agreement. I have records." "Then send me a copy," I said. "I'd love to see that signature." She hesitated just for a second, but I caught it. "Of course," she said. "Expect it in the mail." Then she hung up. I spent the rest of the day trying to focus on sanding down the porch beams, but every hammer strike echoed with her words. "You inherited the obligations." That evening I sat on the porch watching the sun dip behind the trees. For a moment, everything felt peaceful again. The golden light stretching across the fields, the sound of cicadas, the faint smell of rain. Then I heard tires crunching on gravel. A white SUV rolled up to the gate, the kind that screamed, "Committee approved." A woman I didn't recognize stepped out holding a clipboard. "Evening," I called. "Can I help you?" She adjusted her sunglasses even though the sun was gone. "Hi, I'm from the Willow Creek HOA, here to take a few photos for our records. Routine compliance check." I almost laughed out loud. "Compliance with what? There's nothing to comply with. I'm not in your HOA." She smiled the way customer service people do right before they hang up on you. "If you're living within Willow Creek boundaries, you're automatically a member. Just procedure, sir." She started snapping pictures of my fence, the porch, even the new shutters I'd just installed. I felt my blood boil. "Hey, lady, this is private property. You can't just—" But she was already back in her car. "You'll receive correspondence," she said, and drove off without another word. 2 days later, I got that correspondence. Another letter, same crisp paper, same seal, only this one was stamped, "Final Notice." It stated that if I didn't pay the full balance within 10 days, the HOA would pursue legal action. Legal action for dues from 1971. I sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by old photographs and half-empty paint cans, trying to piece together what game Margaret was playing. My grandpa had told me stories about her, sure, how she wanted to turn Willow Creek into a planned community back when disco was still alive. But most of the locals refused to join. My grandpa was the loudest of them all. He called her the land leech, said she couldn't stand that some people liked to live free. Now, half a century later, I was holding a letter that proved she'd never let that grudge die. That night, I went through the attic, rummaging through boxes of my grandfather's things. Most were filled with old tools, tax papers, and letters from the county about farm grants. But tucked in the bottom of one crate was a small metal tin. Inside were folded papers, yellow with age. One of them caught my eye, a property tax receipt dated 1972. At the bottom, a handwritten note, refused HOA dues, property rights non-transferable. My pulse quickened. Grandpa had fought this before, and he'd documented everything. But what really made my stomach twist was another letter. It was from Margaret. Her name, her signature, and her demand for payment, almost identical to mine. She'd tried this before. I sat back against the wall, holding the papers like they were pieces of a puzzle that someone had been hiding for decades. The air felt thick with ghosts. Grandpa's words echoed in my head. Don't let her get her hooks in this land. Now I understood what he meant. This wasn't about money. It was about control. She couldn't stand that the Daniels farmhouse still stood, a reminder that not everyone in Willow Creek bowed to her rules. I looked at that letter again and felt something harden in me. If she wanted a fight, she'd get one. I grabbed my truck keys, tossed the envelope onto the passenger seat, and headed toward the Willow Creek Community Center. Margaret was about to find out. I don't scare easy. The Willow Creek Community Center hadn't changed a bit since the 90s. Same peeling paint on the doors, same faded bulletin board with flyers for bake sales and lost cats, and the same smell of burnt coffee that could peel paint faster than turpentine. I pushed open the door, and the low murmur of voices went quiet. Every head turned toward me like I'd just interrupted Sunday service. There were 6 of them around a long, folding table, all wearing that same polite but frozen expression people get when they know they're about to be entertained. At the head sat Margaret Phelps herself, queen of the HOA kingdom, in a powder blue suit that probably hadn't changed since the Carter administration. "Well," she said, clasping her hands like a preacher welcoming a sinner, "if it isn't young Mr. Daniels, how lovely of you to join us. We don't get many newcomers who actually attend our meetings." I took a seat at the far end of the table. "Not exactly by choice, Margaret. I'm here because of this." I slid the letter across the table. "You billed me for dues that supposedly go back to 1971. A few people murmured. One older man with a red flannel shirt scratched his head. "That's older than my marriage," he whispered to the lady next to him. Margaret gave him a sharp look and turned back to me with her most professional smile. "Yes, about that. Our records show your grandfather was a registered member of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, and as such, any outstanding dues are passed down with the property." "Registered member?" I said, leaning forward. "My grandfather didn't even believe in the HOA. He fought it. I found letters from him saying exactly that." She tilted her head, all condescension and calm poison. "Oh, those letters. Yes, we're aware of his opinions. But opinions don't overrule bylaws, Mr. Daniels." Then she slid a manila folder across the table toward me. "I thought you might appreciate seeing the proof." Inside were old, yellowed papers, meeting minutes, payment records, and near the top, a copy of what she claimed was my grandfather's signed agreement. The signature looked wrong. I'd seen my grandpa's writing on dozens of receipts, even love letters he wrote my grandmother. He had a distinct looping J and a slanted D. The one on this paper looked shaky and stiff, like someone tried too hard to copy it. "This isn't his signature," I said. Margaret didn't even blink. "Well, unless your grandfather is here to contradict it, we'll have to consider it valid." That got a small chuckle from the others at the table, polite, but nervous. I set the paper down slowly. So you're admitting you're trying to collect money on a document you can't verify. Mr. Daniels, she said, leaning forward, her voice tightening, the HOA operates on trust and continuity. We've maintained this community for decades. We expect all residents to contribute fairly. Except this isn't a community, I said. It's a handful of people sitting in a building trying to act like the law. That broke the politeness. One of the men, a short, red-faced guy who looked like he retired from managing a hardware store, slammed his palm on the table. Watch your tone, young man. You're talking about people who built this neighborhood. I looked at him. Sir, my family built half this town before your HOA even existed. That got a few gasps. Margaret stood up, her smile gone. I can see this conversation isn't productive. Perhaps you'd like to take your concerns up with the county, though I doubt they'll be as sympathetic as we are. Trust me, I said, standing too. That's exactly what I plan to do. I turned to leave, but as I reached the door, I heard her voice again, soft but full of warning. You should be careful, Mr. Daniels. Some folks in Willow Creek don't take kindly to disrespecting tradition. I stopped just long enough to glance back. If you mean faking documents and shaking down newcomers for money, that's not tradition. That's extortion. The room fell silent. I walked out, my heart pounding. Outside, the sun was already setting, and the air had that strange heaviness before a storm. Halfway to my truck, I heard the door creak open behind me. The man in the red flannel hurried over. Hey, Daniels, he said in a low voice. You didn't hear this from me, but Margaret's been pulling this stunt for years. She tried it on the Bakers in '94. They moved out a year later. Did she ever win? I asked. He shook his head. No one ever fights her long enough to find out, but she keeps the papers, keeps the threats, she never quits. Then he looked around nervously. Be careful. She's got friends in county records, the kind who make things disappear. I drove home that night with his words rattling in my head. The road wound through the fields, the headlights carving tunnels through the dark. When I pulled up to my farmhouse, something glinted on the gate. Another envelope taped just like the first one. I tore it open under the porch light. Inside was a single sheet of paper, no letterhead this time, just one line printed in bold. We warned you. The paper fluttered in my hand as the wind picked up, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled. I looked out toward the dark road, my gut tightening. Margaret Phelps had just turned this into a war. That night, sleep didn't come easy. Every creak of the old farmhouse sounded like footsteps, every gust of wind like a whisper through the walls. I lay there staring at the ceiling fan turning slow circles, thinking about that note. We warned you. Margaret's voice still echoed in my head, calm, controlled, the kind of tone you hear from people who believe they own everything around them. And maybe, for too long, she had. I couldn't let it go. My grandfather spent his life fighting people like her, folks who saw control as their birthright. If she forged his signature, if she'd been lying for decades, I had to prove it. So at dawn, I climbed into the attic again. The place smelled of dust and history, the kind of musty scent you only get from old wood and older secrets. I pulled open boxes I hadn't touched since moving in, sorting through piles of yellowed newspapers, tax bills, and broken tools until I found the tin box again. This time I looked closer. Beneath the stack of county letters, there was an envelope sealed with tape so old it cracked when I touched it. Inside were documents my grandfather had kept hidden, handwritten notes, copies of legal filings, and what looked like minutes from some long-forgotten town meeting. The first page stopped me cold. Willow Creek Homeowners Association, Charter Proposal, 1971. Across the top was Margaret's name listed as acting chairwoman, and at the bottom my grandfather's name. But next to it in his sharp handwriting were the words, declined to sign, illegitimate entity, no legal basis. I felt a chill crawl down my spine. The documents told a story, one no one in town wanted to talk about. Margaret and her husband had tried to form the HOA 50 years ago, not for community upkeep like she claimed, but to extend control over nearby farmland. The more property under the HOA, the higher the neighborhood's appraised value. It was a land grab, dressed up as civic duty. My grandfather, along with a few others, refused to join. He'd written letters to the county clerk, to the local newspaper, even to a state senator, all warning about a private citizen attempting to impose extra-legal governance. Reading his words, I could practically hear his voice, that deep, stubborn growl I remembered from when I was a kid. He was a man who didn't bow easily. But tucked in the back of the folder was something even stranger, a faded photograph. It showed a group of people standing in front of the community center. Margaret was in the middle, younger, smiling stiffly. My grandfather stood off to the side, arms crossed, scowling. Someone had scribbled on the back in pencil, the day it all began. I sat back on the attic floor, the beam of morning light falling across the photo. My grandfather hadn't just fought her, he'd documented everything. He knew, even then, she wouldn't stop. And now she was trying to finish what she started. By afternoon, I was running on caffeine and adrenaline. I spread all the papers across my kitchen table like a detective in an old movie, notes, receipts, letters, and copies of the supposed charter. One thing was clear, Margaret had never legally registered the HOA with the county. The documents were filled out but never stamped, never approved. And the signatures, the ones she claimed were binding, were forged. Badly. I decided to take them to the county office myself. The clerk on duty was a middle-aged woman with glasses on a chain. When I handed her the papers, she squinted, then smiled faintly. "Oh, Margaret Phelps, that woman's a legend around here." "Yeah," I said, "and I think she's been scamming people for 50 years. She looked through the stack, humming softly. "You might be right. These were never filed. There's no legal HOA here. They have no authority to collect dues." Hearing that was like breathing clean air for the first time in days. "Can you give me proof of that?" I asked. She nodded and typed something into her computer. A minute later, a printer whirred to life, and she handed me a certified document. "Here you go. Official county confirmation, the Willow Creek HOA was proposed but never recorded." I thanked her and drove home, that paper sitting in the passenger seat like a trophy. But when I pulled into my driveway, the victory soured instantly. My mailbox was gone. Ripped clean off the post, bolts and all. The ground was torn up like someone had yanked it out in a hurry. And scattered on the dirt road were shredded pieces of white paper, the same kind of paper my letter from Margaret had been printed on. I got out slowly, scanning the empty road. The wind was still, but the air felt charged, like someone had been here just moments ago. On the gate hung a new envelope. No name, no address, just one sentence typed dead center on the page. "You should have left the past buried." I stood there in silence, the words blurring as anger started to replace fear. Whoever left that note didn't realize something important. I wasn't my grandfather's grandson for nothing. He fought them in the 70s with typewriters and grit. I had the internet, evidence, and one hell of a grudge. If Margaret Phelps wanted a battle over history, she was about to get a war she couldn't rewrite. By the next morning, I wasn't just angry, I was focused. Margaret's warning note still sat on the kitchen counter, but now it looked less like a threat and more like a confession. "You should have left the past buried." That meant there was more down there, something she didn't want unearthed. And I was going to dig until I hit bone. I started with the county archives. The same clerk from the day before Ms. Howell let me into the records room, a cool, dusty vault lined with metal drawers and faded folders. "Knock yourself out," she said, sliding me a visitor badge. "But if you find anything juicy, don't tell me. I'm too old for conspiracies." I smiled at that, but by hour 3, even I was starting to feel paranoid. I pulled everything related to Willow Creek: zoning changes, property disputes, construction permits. Most of it was mundane, until I found a folder labeled 1973, Private Easement Petition, Withdrawn. Inside was a map, my land, Margaret's land, and a shaded area running right between them. A handwritten note across the margin read, "Future expansion. Approved in principle, pending signatures." And at the bottom, I saw something that made my pulse quicken. A second signature line, not just for Margaret and her husband, but for someone from the County Council Oversight Committee. And that name was still very much alive today. Councilman Richard Havers, the same man who, just last week, had posed for photos at the town fair with Margaret, smiling like the king and queen of Willow Creek. I took photos of everything with my phone and left the archives before I could talk myself out of it. Back home I made calls, lots of them. Some went to neighbors, the older ones who still remembered the early days. Most didn't want to talk. One even hung up the moment I mentioned Margaret's name. But finally, I got through to someone who did. "Tommy," said the voice on the other end, rough, gravelly, a man who'd smoked too many cigarettes and kept too many secrets. "You're talking about the HOA thing? Yeah, I remember." He was in his 70s, lived on the far side of the creek. "Your granddad, he stood up to M, paid for it too." "What do you mean?" I asked. "Margaret's husband ran the local loan office back then. Your granddad had a mortgage through M. Funny thing, payments got lost. Late fees piled up. They tried to foreclose, didn't work, but it broke him for a while. He was never the same after that." Silence filled the line for a moment. Then he said something that froze my blood. "They're not just an HOA, son. They're a council, always have been, started with 5 families. They used the HOA as a front to control land values and keep outsiders out. Still do. They just wear friendlier smiles now." "The Council of Shadows," I muttered. He chuckled darkly. "Yeah, that's what your granddad called M." When I hung up, the house suddenly felt smaller, claustrophobic. The shadows in the corners seemed thicker. This wasn't just about forged papers anymore. It was about power, the kind that hides behind neighborhood barbecues and town meetings. And Margaret Phelps wasn't just the face of it. She was the matriarch. That night, I decided to hit back. I uploaded scans of the documents, the fake signatures, the unfiled charters, the county's confirmation that no HOA existed, onto a shared drive. Then I drafted an email addressed to every homeowner in Willow Creek. Subject line: the truth about the HOA. I attached everything, added a short note explaining how the whole system was built on fraud, and how Margaret had been using intimidation and forged authority to keep everyone in line for decades. My finger hovered over the send button, and just before I clicked it, I noticed something outside. Headlights. A car sitting at the end of my driveway, engine running, lights off, just barely visible in the fog. I turned off my own lights and moved to the window, careful not to make a sound. The car idled for a minute, then the headlights flicked on. It pulled away slowly, not down the main road, but toward Margaret's house. I hit send, and as the emails began to fly out, I whispered under my breath, "Game on." By morning, the neighborhood was on fire, not literally, but close. My phone buzzed nonstop. Some people were furious, demanding answers. Others thanked me quietly, afraid to speak too loud. And then came the message I'd been expecting. A text from an unknown number. "You made a mistake, meet me tonight, old barn at the creek, alone." I should have ignored it, but something told me this was Margaret. This was someone inside her circle, maybe even ready to talk. So I grabbed my flashlight, a recorder, and my grandfather's old .38 from the safe. If they wanted to meet in the dark, fine. They'd chosen the wrong man to scare. The air was colder than usual that night, sharp enough to sting when I breathed. The moon hung low and pale over the creek, turning the water into a ribbon of silver. Every few seconds, my flashlight beam bounced off the tall grass, catching a hint of movement, making my pulse spike. The old barn stood where it always had, half-collapsed, leaning into itself, with ivy crawling up the sides like it was trying to pull the whole thing underground. I parked 100 feet away, leaving the headlights off, and walked the rest of the distance in silence. As I got closer, I noticed something odd. The door was already open. A single lantern glowed faintly inside, casting shadows that moved like ghosts across the beams. I stepped in slowly, hand resting on the handle of my grandfather's .38. And that's when I heard it, a voice, low, shaky, familiar. Don't shoot, it's me. Out from behind a stack of old hay bales stepped Robert Klein, the HOA's treasurer, or, well, Margaret's treasurer. He looked nothing like the smug, tie-wearing accountant I'd seen at board meetings. His face was pale, eyes bloodshot, and his hands trembled as he lit a cigarette. "I figured you'd come," he said. "You're just like your grandfather, couldn't leave well enough alone." I kept my distance. "Then you know I don't take kindly to blackmail. What's this about?" He laughed, but there wasn't much humor in it. "You think I'm the one blackmailing you? Buddy, we're both on the chopping block." He pulled out an envelope from his jacket, yellowed, sealed, and marked with a red stamp. "Confidential, Willow Creek Council." "She made me do it," he said. "Margaret. She told me to keep the books clean, no questions, no gaps. But then those dues from 1971 came up again. I told her we couldn't bill for something that old. She said it wasn't about money anymore, it was about keeping control." He tossed the envelope toward me. "Inside, the proof. The land deeds, the forged signatures, it's all there. The whole council knows, but they're scared. They've built their little kingdom on lies. If you tear it down, they lose everything." I crouched and picked up the envelope. "So why me?" "Because your granddad started this mess," Robert said. "He found the original charter, the real one, the one that said the HOA was never supposed to exist. When he tried to expose them, they made him disappear, not kill him, ruin him. Took his loans, his land, his peace of mind. Margaret called it a lesson in humility." The barn creaked as a gust of wind passed through. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then headlights flashed through the cracks in the wood. Robert's cigarette dropped from his lips. "They followed you," he whispered. I turned toward the door, but it was too late. A car door slammed outside, then another. Robert panicked. "You've got to go, they can't know I talked to you." He shoved the envelope into my chest and pushed me toward the back exit. "Use the creek path, they won't find you there." "Come with me," I said. He shook his head. "If they find me gone, they'll know. I'll buy you a few minutes." I hesitated, but the crunch of gravel outside told me time was up. I slipped out the back, crouching low as I made my way through the reeds. The flashlight beam from the front door swept across the field, slicing the dark like a knife. I didn't stop until I was halfway down the creek, lungs burning, shoes soaked. Then a sound. One sharp crack, echoing across the water. A gunshot. I froze, turning back toward the barn. The light inside flickered once, then went out. For a long moment, all I could hear was the rush of the creek and the hammering in my chest. Robert Klein, the one man who tried to help me, was gone. I looked down at the envelope still clutched in my hand. The edges were damp from sweat and creek mist, but it was intact. I wanted to tear it open right there, but something inside told me not to, not yet, not in the open. So I tucked it into my jacket and kept walking, back toward the farmhouse. Behind me in the distance, another engine started up. The headlights turned toward the road, toward me. They were hunting now. By the time I got home, the adrenaline had turned to rage. I laid the envelope on the table, stared at it under the yellow light, and realized what this meant. This wasn't a fight about property lines or old bills. It was about legacy, about my grandfather's name, about the truth buried under 50 years of intimidation and greed. Margaret thought she could scare me into silence, but she just gave me something to fight for. I looked at the gun, then the envelope, and I whispered to the empty house, "You've had 50 years, Margaret, your time's up." By sunrise, I hadn't slept a wink. The envelope sat on the kitchen table, yellowed and fragile under the dim light. I'd spent the whole night packing around it like it was a live grenade, afraid of what might happen when I finally opened it. But after what happened to Robert, I knew there was no turning back. I slid a knife under the flap and broke the seal. The smell of old paper and mildew hit me like a wave. Inside were at least a dozen documents, typed letters, meeting notes, and carbon copies of land agreements. Some were so old the ink had faded into gray ghosts. The first page was dated March 3rd, 1971, a memorandum titled Formation of Willow Creek Homeowners Council. The words that followed twisted my stomach. Purpose: to establish ownership, continuity, and collective control of regional land interests under the guise of a homeowners association. Such status shall prevent external acquisition, ensure property management oversight, and maintain social order. Under the guise, they weren't forming an HOA to manage lawns or collect dues. They were building a legal fortress, a way to lock out anyone who wasn't part of their founding families. And there, listed among the founding five, was a name I hadn't expected: Thomas Reed. My grandfather. For a few seconds, everything blurred. I blinked hard and looked again just to be sure. It was him, his signature shaky, unmistakable. But the deeper I read, the stranger it got. A handwritten note, stapled to the corner of the document, read: TR refuses to sign final draft. Disagrees with fund allocations and voting control clause. Recommend removal from board. Below that, another page, a resolution of council, had been stamped and signed. Thomas Reed's dissent deemed disruptive to the foundational principles. His name shall remain for appearance of consensus. Future meetings to exclude him. They forged his agreement to make it look like he was part of their corruption. I sat there, gripping the paper until my hands shook. All those years, the rumors that my grandfather had ruined the HOA deal, the whispers that he'd been stubborn and paranoid, they weren't stories. They were cover-ups. They destroyed his reputation, so no one would listen to him. And then, buried deep in the folder, I found one final letter. It was addressed to Margaret Phelps. Margaret, as discussed, ensure Mr. Reed's files are secured before transfer. If he refuses to comply, the bank will intervene. We cannot allow the charter's original version to surface. It would nullify all current authority. Do what you must. No signature, no date, just an initial RH. Councilman Richard Havers. I pushed back from the table and let out a sharp breath. It all clicked together: the bills, the threats, the sudden reappearance of dues from 1971. They weren't collecting money. They were burying a loose end. Me. I stood, grabbed my phone, and called the county records office again. Ms. Howell, I said, trying to sound calm. That file from the 1970s, the Willow Creek easement petitions. Can you check if any revisions were filed after 1973? There was a pause on the other end. Then, funny you ask, someone came in this morning asking for the same file. Who? Didn't give a name, but they said they were from the HOA board. My blood went cold. Margaret knew. By noon, my driveway was full of cars. SUVs, all black, all spotless. People in business casual stepped out like they were attending a board meeting, not a confrontation. Margaret led the pack, her red blazer bright against the gray sky. She smiled as she approached my porch, that fake, sweet smile she always wore when she was about to lie. Tommy, she said, we need to talk. I crossed my arms. You mean about how you and Havers used my grandfather's name to start your little empire? Her smile faltered for the first time. You shouldn't play with things you don't understand. I understand perfectly, I said. You've been running a scam for 50 years. You forged his signature, took his land, and now you're trying to silence me the same way. Her eyes narrowed, the act slipping. Your grandfather was a traitor to the community. He wanted to sell this land to outsiders, people who didn't belong here. We protected Willow Creek. Protected it? You turned it into your private kingdom. The others shifted uncomfortably behind her. She could feel them wavering, her perfect little army cracking under the weight of truth. Margaret leaned closer. You don't know what you're inviting, boy. There are records you haven't seen, people who won't let this place fall apart. I smiled. Then maybe it's time I introduce them to the sheriff's office. For the first time, her confidence broke. You wouldn't dare. Oh, I already did, I said, pulling my phone from my pocket. Everything you forged, every name you used, it's all been backed up and sent out, including that letter from Havers. Her face went pale. You're lying. Before I could answer, one of the men behind her spoke up. Margaret, is that true? She spun on him, furious. Don't you dare question me." But she didn't finish, because at that moment, the wail of sirens echoed from the main road. They froze. Every one of them turned toward the sound, blue lights flashing through the trees, growing closer. I stepped back toward the porch railing, heart pounding but steady. "This time," I said quietly, "you won't bury the truth." Margaret stared at me, eyes full of something I'd never seen before, not anger, not fear, but realization. The walls she'd built for 50 years were crumbling in real time. Then she whispered, almost to herself, "You really are your grandfather's grandson." And as the first patrol car pulled into the drive, she straightened her jacket and said, "This isn't over." I looked her dead in the eye. "No, Margaret, it's finally over." The sheriff's car stopped in a crunch of gravel and silence fell over the yard. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The same deputy who'd once brushed me off about HOA rules stepped out, only this time his expression wasn't bored. It was grim. He tipped his hat toward me. "Mr. Reed," he said, "we got your file." Then his gaze shifted to Margaret. "And we've got a few questions for you, ma'am." Her jaw tightened, but she didn't move. "Sheriff, this is a misunderstanding. These accusations are absurd. That young man been trespassing in private HOA records." The sheriff raised a brow. "Funny thing about that, Mrs. Phelps. County clerk says there aren't any HOA records filed. So either the county's wrong," he took a slow step forward, "or you've been running an unregistered association for half a century." The color drained from her face. Behind her, a few of her board members started whispering nervously. One woman, I think her name was Linda, muttered, "I told you this would catch up with us." Margaret shot her a glare sharp enough to cut glass. "Quiet." But it was too late. The deputies were already opening folders, comparing signatures, reading off names. I watched as the empire my grandfather had once warned about began to unravel in front of me, not with gunfire or chaos, but with silence, shame, and the sound of pen scratches on arrest forms. "Sheriff," I said quietly, "there's more you should see." I handed him the envelope Robert Klein had given me, the one I'd risked my life for. He flipped through it, scanning the forged charter, the letters, the falsified easement maps. His expression hardened. "Where'd you get this?" "From your HOA treasurer," I said. "He's dead." The deputy looked up, eyes wide. "Dead." "Shot," I said. "Last night in the old barn by the creek." The sheriff looked at Margaret, whose face twitched just slightly, a flicker of guilt or maybe fear. "Mrs. Phelps," he said slowly, "you wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" She straightened. "Of course not. That man was unstable, probably took his own life." But her voice shook, just enough to betray her. The sheriff nodded to his deputy. "We'll see about that. You're coming with us." When they read her rights, she didn't protest. She just stared at me, cold and tired, like a woman watching her own reflection shatter. "You think this makes you the hero," she said as they led her past me. "But you don't understand what you've done. You've opened the door to outsiders, to developers. They'll gut this place. Everything your grandfather loved will be gone." I met her gaze. "No, Margaret, you already gutted it. I'm just cleaning up the bones." By sunset, the yard was empty. The patrol cars were gone, the whispers faded, and the old farmhouse finally felt quiet again. I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the orange light spill across the fields. For the first time since I'd come back, I didn't feel like an intruder. I felt like the land finally recognized me. I thought about Robert Klein, the man who'd tried to set things right, and about my grandfather who'd carried the truth alone for too long. I pulled out the last page from the folder, one I hadn't noticed before. It was a handwritten note folded tight between the documents. My grandfather's handwriting. "If anyone finds this, tell the truth, even if it costs you everything, because land doesn't belong to those who build fences. It belongs to those who keep it honest." I read it twice before setting it down. That's when the headlights appeared. For a split second, my stomach tightened. But this time it was Margaret or her counsel. It was a pickup truck, old, dented, familiar. The driver stepped out, sheriff. He had a file under his arm. "Got something for you," he said, walking up the steps. "Counties nullified the HOA charter. Turns out it never existed legally, just like you said." He handed me a single sheet of paper, stamped and signed. "Property released from all liens and association claims." "Looks like your family's finally free," he said. I smiled, though it felt bittersweet. "Took us 50 years. He nodded, "Better late than never." He paused, then added, "For what it's worth, your granddad would have been proud." When he drove off, the night fell still again, peaceful, but heavy with everything that had happened. I stood there for a long time, staring at the fields. The crickets sang, the trees whispered, and somewhere in the distance, the creek murmured the same tune it had when I was a boy. This land had seen greed, lies, and blood, but it had also seen redemption. And as the stars blinked to life overhead, I whispered to the wind, "We're home again, Grandpa, for good this time." Then I turned back toward the house, my house, the same one that had been stolen, shamed, and reclaimed by truth. And for the first time, I locked the door not out of fear, but out of peace. You've heard this confession, now wait until you hear the next one, the truth that shatters everything you thought you knew.